Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me and see Dr. Gary Shapiro. We want to welcome you and thanks for tuning in. My name is Gregory Tague. I'm Professor Emeritus at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm with Dr. Gary Shapiro to talk about his new book, Out of the Cage, My Half-Century Journey from Curiosity to Concern for Indonesia's Person of the Forest. It's published by Mad Duck Coalition, and it will be available very soon. If you go to the chat, you will see I added in a number of links. Two links you can use to order the book, one for Amazon, one for the publisher. There's another link. There's another link for the Orangutan Republic Foundation. That's the foundation that Gary set up. And then there's a link to his personal website. Gary Shapiro has over 50 years of experience in orangutan research and conservation. In 1973, he began teaching a symbolic communication system to an orangutan at Chaffee Zoological Park. From 1978 to 1981, he furthered this work in Tanjung Puting National Park, that's in Borneo, teaching sign language to ex-captive orangutans in their natural habitat. I don't know if anyone has done that since either. So this Zoom meeting was not set up as a webinar. I've therefore muted all of you, if that's okay. Towards the end of the talk that Gary and I have, somewhere around 45 minutes, Gary will do a reading from the book. And then after that, we can take questions from the chat. I can't promise that we'll get to all the questions, but if you have a question, you can put it in the chat somewhere around that 45-minute mark, and we'll see what we can deal with. We'll try to keep this to about an hour. Okay, so welcome everyone, welcome Gary. And I'd like to start off with this question, which is actually two. Why is your book important now? And in answering, could you briefly unpack the subtitle with a few quick facts about orangutans?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Gregory, for hosting this event at the Brooklyn Book Festival. I'm really happy to be here. So, yeah, so you asked the question, why is this book important now? Well, I think we're living in a time where we all see that the world is in need for um, good stories about what's happening in this world and how people can get involved, particularly young people. Um, we're having a crisis with biodiversity. Our environment is at risk, as we all know, with global climate change. And the stories that I talk about go into some of this with regards to what's happening in the forests of, say, Borneo. And the stories about orangutans they're kind of symbolic of the rest of life in the forest, although because of their intellect and their abilities that we talk about in the book, um, they demand further attention as well. And so we know that there's also a kind of a global shift towards animal rights issues. And I talk about some of that in the book as well. But, you know, it's also a prescription for what we can do to address some of the conservation issues that we're facing in this world. So I think it's timely. And clearly, it's a book that's long overdue from my perspective. I've been asked for many, many years to write this thing. And it was really you who was kind of the impetus to get me to put it together and get it out. So thank you for that. As far as the subtitle, my 50-year journey, um, from curiosity to concern for Indonesia's person of the forest, as you know, that the word orangutan does mean person of the forest. And I think that's an important point that we should discuss at some point. That orangutans are deserving of personhood status, and I think many of the characteristics that they possess, not just the biological, but the psychological and sociological, are characteristics that align them with us and should give us a little bit of um, you know, an ability to wrap the idea of giving orangutans and other great apes personhood status. So I think those are the two main things you asked me about. Some quick facts about orangutans. Now, maybe people don't know this, but they're Asia's only great ape. The rest of the great apes are found in Africa, the bonobos, chimpanzees, and gorillas. But orangutans are uniquely found on the islands in the wild, on the islands of Borneo and Sumatra. The wild populations now in the northern part of the island. And, they're the largest arboreal animals, mammals in the world. And they spend, of course, most of their time in the treetops looking for food, fruit mostly. And so their life is pretty much geared in this three-dimensional space in the trees, and they have to understand what's going on up there. They have incredible strength. This is something that perhaps we maybe think quite about, the chimpanzees and gorillas, fast, dangerous, very, very strong. Orangutans are very strong also. And an adolescent or a juvenile could certainly manhandle an adult male if they wanted to. But we can psychologically sometimes keep them from being hurtful to us if we learn how to read them and learn how to work around them properly. They're also critically endangered. The three species of orangutans that are now defined, the Bornean, Sumatran, and Tapanuli, the most recently described, are critically endangered, with the Tapanuli maybe only 800 individuals left. So, on a conservation side, they are certainly orangutans are a species that demand protection. And so what I've been doing since the days of wrapping up the signing work has been working in the areas of conservation and also educating people about their plight. So yeah, that kind of a few facts there.
Okay, great. No, thank you for answering that opening question. Um, I, Gary's book is not available yet. It will be out in a couple of weeks. As I said, if you just joined, check the chat. I put some links in there. You can order the book. The book is fascinating. And in addition to all the scientific information and data and whatever about orangutans and their abilities and their status and how they should be considered persons, there's also a lot of personal information about Gary's journey. So my second question, I want you to tell us how chance factored into the trajectory of your life and how much of that was, really your own kind of willpower and character, how you made this happen.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think I talk about it in the book. I didn't really plan to go into primatology or work with orangutans when I started my college, my junior college days after high school. I was really interested in marine biology and becoming the next Jacques Cousteau. I had gotten certified when I was 16, and I was really interested in pursuing an academic career and a postgraduate career in marine biology or oceanography. I'd hoped to go to Scripps or Woods Hole to study the oceans, which I was very, very fascinated with. I still am. But as chance would have it, while I was at my junior college, um, I got a chance to pick up Dr. Jane Goodall at the airport and take her to our community college for a speaking engagement that night. And this was a chance to meet somebody who clearly was, she was just 10 years in Gombe. She just stepped out and was doing some lecturing, and I happened to be given the chance to take her to the college, took her to her hotel, and I was in her hotel room, and she picked up the phone and called uh, Alan and Beatrice Gardner, the couple who had raised and educated Washoe, the first signing ape, chimpanzee, um, at the University of Reno, and Jane invited them to come across the Sierra Nevadas to the college and attend her presentation. I sat next to the Gardners that night, and I had forgotten about that. I went off to Fresno State College and was pursuing a degree in biology and zoology. Um, and when it came time to work on my master's degree, the thesis, I was thinking of something I could do because I was given a chance to work at the Fresno City Zoo at the time, and noticed they had an orangutan, a young Sumatran orangutan. And I thought, you know, maybe I could do something that nobody has tried yet, and that would be to teach sign language to this orangutan. And I called the gardeners. I contacted them and I said, I have this chance. And they said to me, well, given the amount of time you have, you might want to try something different. At that time, a psychologist named David Premack had been working with a chimpanzee at Santa Barbara, and was using these plastic symbols to teach the chimpanzee Sarah how to learn some of the exemplars of language. So I visited the campus, talked uh, to Mr. Dr. Premack, and as I got onto campus, I actually saw there was like one of his students working with an orangutan. And it was like, wow, well, he's already working with an orangutan. And so I asked him about it, and he says, oh, it's nothing, nothing. We're just, looking around at the possibility, but he wasn't really working very, very hard with this particular individual. But got me to thinking I needed to start working on my project. So I went back to the university and started to start the project, but instead of using plastic symbols that were, say, created, I just went to the toy store and got these plastic children's letters and used those as the symbols and went into the cage with Azak and spent time with her. So that was how I got into it. It was kind of a chance thing. Um, and from that experience, when I graduated from Fresno with my master's, I had hoped to go into medical school. That didn't work, so I went off to the University of Oklahoma, where I received an opportunity to work with Dr. Roger Fouts, who was the student of the Gardners and who had Washoe, the chimpanzee, now at the Institute for Primate Studies. So from that point in 1975, I was then working across campus in the Department of Psychology when I was in zoology, and going out to the Institute working with the chimpanzees. And during the time I was working with Allie, a chimpanzee at the Institute, teaching Allie some of the concepts, or studying his ability to comprehend signing, I got the call from Roger saying, would you like to go out to the jungles of Borneo? And I said, yeah. And so that started me onto the adventure that really changed my life, because it was out there I really fell in love with orangutans and rainforests, and realized that it was really critical that we focus our attention on preserving them as well as studying them. So, yeah, anyway, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. It's a fascinating story, and you do a great job laying out all the details in the book. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little about the changes in Borneo, because people may not know this if they haven't read the book, especially, or if they don't know about you. but you make 2 trips a year to Indonesia.
I try.
You speak their language.
Mhm.
Could you talk to us a little about the changes between 1978 and now? Maybe describe the rugged conditions at Camp Leakey. I mean, it's really funny, some of the stories you have in the book,
Yeah,
and maybe a couple of how that plays into the narrative and your work with orangutans, and maybe talk just a little about um, we'll get into this later because I know you want to spend some time talking about a particular orangutan princess, but maybe just talk a little about their personality. So, what was it like in 78? What's it like now?
yeah. Well, again, when I went out in 1978, the big issue, and I'll just say, life out there, if you look at it at a macroscopic level, it hasn't changed that much. I mean, it's very rustic, wooden structures. You've got people living along the river, still in thatched huts. It's an ecosystem that I've noticed has changed dramatically over the 40 years or so since the last, when I was out there, 40 some odd years. We saw the river at the time. It was a Blackwater River flowing as a Blackwater River should, very acidic. It's turbid in some parts, but transparent. And you know, when when gold mining came in, it really upset the watershed and caused a great amount of sediment to come in, including some of the mercury that was being used in the gold mines to that impacted the area. The big problem back then, though, was logging, illegal logging, and I think when we got into the 90s, we noticed that everything is now shifting from logging to estate plantations, predominantly palm oil. And so that became another kind of a macro issue out there around the camp. The park itself, it started out as a reserve when I was out there. And it was over a period of time when researchers and conservation um, uh, biologists came out to study the area that the government received enough information and proposals that the Indonesian government, changed it to a national park in 1982. So that was a change in its status that took place. It's still, of course, a national park. It's a park that has a variety of different ecosystems that are amazing. The freshwater swamp, peat swamp forests, for example, the heath forests. Um, those are still there, but if you look around the park, you see increasing amounts of human activity, whether it's the palm oil plantations, the gold mines that really moved up the left side of the Seconia River upwards. And so that has had a major impact. What I noticed in my last trip there in June is that the water now is flowing clean. And it's one of the reasons is that the river upstream from Camp Leakey, which is where we were, the main branch is now closed off with river weeds, these macrophytes. And I talk about the macrophytes in the book as we head upstream. I mean, these are amazing natural filtration systems that are growing along the perimeter or the edge of the river. And if you go to some of the rivers, it completely closes off and you can't pass, through with on a boat. You literally have to haul the boats over these plants. And and today we notice upriver, the macrophytes are up there. They are filtering out the sediment. It also means the people can't get out to do the gold mining. And so now the river is flowing a bit more cleanly as it was back in 1986 when I went out there to do a self-funded postdoctoral study on the Blackwater River. Not orangutans, but on the river. So the area has changed quite a bit over the decades. It's still, an amazing place to visit. Um, and another thing that's changed that maybe I can talk about is how the rehabilitation of the orangutans has changed over the years. When Berte Galdikas and I were out there, we were rehabilitating orangutans. It was kind of done at a low scale. There was no guidebooks on how to do this. We received these ex-captive orangutans from the government, or sometimes people gave them to us, or we were able to be part of a confiscation group that got them from people who were holding them illegally, and they were being given the opportunity within this bicultural environment where many of the individuals, once they got out of quarantine, would be walking around Camp Leakey and just carrying on with their lives as we gave them opportunities to learn about making nests or how to find food on their own. Occasionally, of course, we took them in, gave them medicines, this and that. But all that changed when more and more orangutans started to be rescued, and other organizations were setting up rehabilitation, and now they changed the name to reintroduction facilities. So reintroduction became the more technical term, which involves a set of processes where not only are the orangutans put into quarantine and tested to make sure they were healthy, they were put into socialization cages to allow them to interact with each other, taken out, going to baby school, taken off to islands where they can learn more skills, and then eventually relocated. But they weren't living intimately with the humans. There's kind of a hands-off attitude. And the idea is to make them somewhat afraid of us or not want to spend time with us. They should go back to the wild and not have anything to do with people. So that's kind of how rehabilitation, reintroduction has changed over the years. And, frankly, it's really a methodology where we have veterinarians, we have animal managers, and most of this is now being done, in fact, I think almost exclusively by the Indonesians themselves. So over this 40 some odd years, there has been a shift from a large Western presence um, in view of the world to now we have more of the Indonesian uh, wildlife managers, veterinarians involved with how this is taking place. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's good that we're involving the local people in this whole process because ultimately it's their responsibility.
I know that you're responsible for at least some of that, maybe a lot of it, and people will read about it in the book. As a kind of follow-up, and while I was listening, but I'm looking at the chat, and I don't really want to do questions now, but I see some people preempted my next question, which is kind of a follow-up to the early one. Could you talk to us a little about the politics of environmental enforcement and touch on forest concessions? But I'm a little less interested in the logging, the mining, and the corporate AG concessions. And I thought if it's okay, if you could talk about the land concession that you and Life Cox of the orangutan um,
Project.
project worked on.
Well, I can just tell you that working in Indonesia is very complex. And when you are trying to, for example, deal with issues that are, multifaceted with multiple stakeholders, there's no one size fits all, and there's no, black and white frequently out there. One has to realize that Indonesia was colonized for 350 years by the Dutch. They got their independence after World War II, and they have been struggling to build a thriving economy for, the fourth largest population in the world, just after the United States. They have to take care of their people, and so with that, it's very, very important to understand the government's perspective on what's going on out there, and they do want to preserve and maintain a large areas of rainforest. Clearly the movement towards establishing national parks, protected areas, government forests, are the step in that right direction. Enforcement, however, of the laws that protect the animals and the habitat aren't so easily enforced, especially when it's difficult to get out there, and when you've got it's challenging to mount expeditions by the forest police or anybody in the government to do this on a regular basis. Thankfully, we have technology like satellites and overflights, so we can monitor and give feedback. But we have to also remember to do that in a way that is not going to um, insult the Indonesian government in ways that we can sometimes do that as, Westerners. We sometimes throw our money around and expect them to do things according to the way we would like them to. It's really vital that we work within their system and understand that we have to move according to their policies and procedures. And so if we do that, if we work and we're looked upon as favorable, um, you know, entities, whether we're individuals or organizations, they are more inclined to work favorably with us. And so, for example, today we have an opportunity to not only encourage the government to create more and more parks and protected areas. The laws now allow people and organizations in Indonesia to acquire concessions, forest concessions, for things like, it could be mining, it could be forestry, or it could be conservation work, which is something that we believe should be done in a more vigorous way. And we're encouraging the companies that we partner with to go forward and to pursue acquiring large tracts of land, particularly when they're the right size, shape, and type. Because, one can get areas that are at a high altitude, but there may be very few animals up there, charismatic ones like orangutans or elephants. They like the lowlands, and those are the ones that are valuable for agriculture. So again, it's trying to find those right parcels of land and then working within the system to establish these new areas that will be protected. And again, if it's something that's done privately, well, then it's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the company to maintain the integrity of that area. So again, what's really good is that there is a framework. They have an orangutan action plan. We try to work, of course, with the entities and the government that not only give us the authority to work out there, but also are trying to coordinate the work. And with many, many groups now, since the ones that I helped start, you know, 40 some odd years ago or 40 years ago, we're finding that we can now pool our efforts in ways to leverage and magnify the effect of the funding we get, which isn't always great. So I think that's the other thing we can talk about, and I talk about that in the book as well.
Yeah. In fact, um, you had mentioned early on Berute Galdikas, who is still there. One of the trimates, for those who you don't know, trimate is a title that was bestowed upon Berute Galdikas, Jane Goodall, and Diane Fossey by Louis Leakey, the famed paleoanthropologist, and that's why Galdikas named her encampment Camp Leakey. But anyway, I mentioned this because you and Dr. Galdikas, um, and you outline this in the book, had started the foundation.
That's correct.
And you did a lot of work and you worked very hard. Your wife was involved in it. It's a really interesting story. But I wanted to know if you could tell us a little about your foundation, yours meaning the one that was started by you and Ingriani, your wife, and the mission of that, specifically the education mission. That's what kind of brought you and me together. Why is the focus on education so important? And I don't know if you want to mention as part of this answer why you chose not to go into an academic career. I mean, you did all this field work, amazing work. I mean, you had mentioned, and I know people were paying attention, that in addition to the work with the orangutans, you also did this study on the Blackwater River.
Yeah,
I mean, you could have had a tenure track job,
yeah, yeah.
published and gotten tenure somewhere, but you chose not to. So maybe a little about the foundation, the emphasis on education, and why not an academic career?
Yeah, well, that's great. That's a great question. I talk a little bit about that in the book, but perhaps not as much as I could mention here. Um, yeah, and I'll start backwards because I think the fact that I found employment when I was finishing up my PhD, in government, in Oklahoma state government. I worked for the Oklahoma Water Resources Board as a biologist. Studying, the chlorophyll in the lakes, the many reservoirs of Oklahoma, and doing these studies. And I found it fascinating. I found it really, really interesting and getting paid to do this kind of work. And I said to myself, nobody's ever gone back to Borneo or done a study on blackwater rivers in Borneo of using this kind of technology. And so even before I finished my degree with the orangutans, I was thinking about going back and studying the rivers because I fell in love with those rivers when I was out there. I would go swimming every day, sometimes with Princess on my back. We'd swim together in the water, and I would go under and I would be kind of like channeling the spirit of a crocodile. And I'd be, holding my breath and crawling along the bottom, hoping not to really run into one because that's not a
Not,
good thing.
I don't want to interrupt you, but just so people know, Princess, not the Princess of Indonesia,
No.
Princess was one of the main orangutan students of Gary.
Yes, yes. I should clarify. Princess was my orangutan daughter and one of my students for the
We'll get to her later, though. We'll get to her later.
Yeah, but again, the the question that you asked about why I didn't go into government or I didn't go into academia, that was partially because I channeled myself into government and had a full-time career while at the same time helping to establish the Orangutan Foundation and Orangutan Foundation International with Birute. I did that while I was working for the state of California when I came out to California and did that to pay the bills. So, why didn't I, decide to go back into academia? Partly it's more challenging to get a tenure track position. I was already vested with state government, and it made sense for me to kind of stay along that path. The foundations that I created gave me the outlet to go into some aspects of academia. And I think that's been one of the things that's really made me feel satisfied as somebody who has a passion for what he's doing. And that is working with young people who want to get involved with with conservation or with primates or giving them advice. And many of the people I spoke to when I was at the Orangutan Foundation International went off to get their PhDs. And it just makes me feel like I don't have to be a professor in a university to have an impact on people and in this way. So yeah, the foundation I started that with Birute, 1985, 1986 is the first orangutan advocacy group, and served as vice president for 18 years. But clearly, I felt that not enough was being done to address the core issues or the root issues of why orangutans were flowing into the rehab centers, and that really had to do with educating local people about the laws and about, addressing their concerns about issues of poverty, things of that nature that the foundation wasn't doing. And so that was the impetus. And so that's why my wife and I started the Orangutan Republic Foundation.
So just a couple of related questions. These are not really big questions, but following up on what you were saying about the foundation work, especially yours and the focus of it on education.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for young people who are looking for careers in environmental field work? And even from that, I mean, do you have any advice for young people who want to go into business, finance, or government?
Yeah, yeah. I think that the zeitgeist is shifting in economics, and there is a realization that we have to factor in the economics of biodiversity. And if we do that, if we understand the value that biodiversity plays as we go into businesses, and not just write it off as an externality and not even consider it. It's important to kind of bring the biology and the biodiversity into whatever area of business you're going to go into. If you don't want to go into, say, being a conservationist in the field, you still need to, I think, have a good understanding about the value of biodiversity. That will only increase in the years to come, particularly as habitats shrink and become more valuable. And how do we bring that into the picture? I think more and more coursework has to be developed, and I think there will be more advanced courses in this in the universities. But if you're going to go into what I was doing, for example, and want to be in the field, clearly having a background, you don't have to be a biologist necessarily. You could do that from another perspectives. Um, and again, I was interested in the psychology of orangutans as much as I was in their environment as a zoologist and biologist. So I would just say, be well-rounded in your academic um, coursework that you do, and make sure that you have a chance also to understand uh, what the role of the different entities in the field are doing, especially whether it's government or the nonprofit sector. One of the things we try to do in our orangutan caring scholarship program that our foundation funds is to involve the students in the universities with the nonprofits who are working in the communities at the perimeter of the park, or in areas where orangutans may wander out. So the idea is to see how that fits into their curriculum and provide them with additional um, training in say technical areas. Um, so my advice, getting back to your question, is to get a very strong foundation, of course, in the biological side, the wildlife management, if you can. Certainly, environmental sciences is important, and then economics, as I mentioned before. And in fact, there are a lot of people who are interested in the environmental law and international environmental law. That is another very rich area where people could get involved in, because as you see the issues between countries that share borders or ecosystems, sometimes there are issues that come about over those areas. And so having people who are clearly skilled at this and have a knowledge of it would be very, very valuable.
And animal law. And I don't want to get into it because I want to move on to a main question now, but animal law as well. And for those of you, and I hope all of you will, buy and read Gary's book, there's quite a bit in there about the orangutan Sandra in Argentina, who's now in Florida. But that's another story. We may not get to that. So, based on your own life story, there's quite a bit at stake in terms of biodiversity. Okay, now, because I want to try to keep things moving and stick to a certain schedule here. You have lots of stories about your encounter, and I see we have at least two really good questions that I want to get to.
Okay.
You, Gary, have lots of stories about your encounters with ex-captive, free-ranging orangutans. But now, tell us about Princess. And if you want, you can focus specifically on her theory of mind and tool use.
Yeah, yeah. What an opportunity. I had a chance to do something which is almost impossible to do anymore. You can't do this because of health and safety. now that everything has gone to this institutional way of reintroducing, the one-on-one that I had with Princess and Rennie and all the other orangutans are, you can't, it's hard to do it. In fact, I would be really, really surprised if the government of Indonesia allowed that to happen again. Now, having said that, I can tell you that the kinds of experiences I had with, say, Princess, um, where she lived with me every day when I was there at Camp Leakey. Of course, sometimes I'd have to go to town or go somewhere, to Jakarta or something like that. She couldn't go with me on those occasions. But when I was at Camp Leakey, she treated me like her adopted mom, or I was of course the dad, but she treated me as if I was her major caretaker. And with that came how she wanted to interact with me, how she had to kind of predict what I wanted to do, or how she could eventually um, kind of control how I would work with her. Those are the kinds of things that we talk about when we mention theory of mind. The ability to kind of simulate in your own mind what some other individual is thinking or is cogitating. And so she had to do that with me, and she did that when she was young. When she would say, go in, hop into bed, I would hop into bed with her, and then she might sneak out. And, she knew I was, and get into things. And then if I caught her, she wouldn't put up a fuss. She would go back to bed. And, these are the kinds of things that you would realize. You don't have to put her into, some kind of a laboratory and give her all this kind of testing to show that she had this theory of mind. You know, Orangutans prevaricate, they lie, and they know how to get you focused on one thing and at the same time use their foot as another appendage to pick your pockets. Keep you engaged over here while they're busy unzipping your backpack looking for goodies. And Princess used to do that as well. She would use her sign language again to get things that were important to her, but she also knew that she could easily grab me by the hand and take me places and try to get me to do things for her. And so over the course of our time together, those are the kinds of experiences and examples I could give you to express her theory of mind. And when you talk about tool use, she became one of the more, I think, adept tool users. And I have to think that maybe her getting involved with signing early on prepared her mind for combining objects in her environment to be used as new tools. So she knew how to use saws to cut logs. I mean, she didn't do it just to make two pieces of wood. She used it to get in to the wood because she may be able to find something of value to eat, or some sap or something tasty, right? So they're using the tools as ways to get food. And this is what the wild orangutans do as well in Sumatra, mostly to get access to seeds inside of fruits that just can't be opened easily, or fishing for termites. So orangutans, in case of Princess, she was very, very clever at using human tools. She watched people using toothbrushes or brushes, and she would make good use of those as well. And there was I describe in the book one day when I woke up and I saw her at the base of the bed with the mosquito net wrapped around something, and she was biting into it. And I took it away from her, opened it up, and it was a leech, a terrestrial leech, who had been coming up into my bed at night, taking its blood meal, and dropped off. Princess saw it. She didn't want to touch the leech, so she wrapped it up in the mosquito net and was biting on it. And again, showing that she was able to make use of things as protectors, as barriers from something that might be dangerous. That is tool use as well. So Princess was very, very good at that. Um, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, yeah. Read his book, read Dr. Shapiro's book. There are many stories in there. I think it's fair to say Princess is a central character, but there are others as well. Rennie, for
Right.
instance, which is
Yeah.
the one you started with mainly.
Well, she was the one that I first met the day I actually arrived at Camp Leakey. And I saw her pacing across the river. And the next day I swam across the river and I got to meet her. And that was probably one of the most exciting things that ever happened to me, not knowing how she would react to me as an adult female orangutan. But the book describes some very interesting things that happened. And I'll let you read the book to get at that.
Okay, great. Yeah. Um, so it's 7:45, almost 7:46. Um, I would like to get to these questions, but before we do that, Gary and I allotted some time for him to do a reading, and he's going to read a selection that helps you understand, orangutan, person of the forest, but even beyond that, the kind of personality, almost human personality. Well, it's an orangutan personality. I'm not trying to make false comparisons here. So, could you read that little selection for us, Gary?
I'd be happy to. It's really about the chapter on a perception of fairness and equity and inequity, because orangutans, like many great apes, understand this. Um, and so this is about, it says, I personally experienced the pain of retribution given to me by an orangutan whom I very much liked and respected. It happened in the late 1980s during an Earthwatch expedition. Now, Camp Leakey was hosting nearly a dozen tourists on a working vacation as a way to generate funds. I had been visiting Camp Leakey at the time and was planning on doing a dive after the trip in Bali. The orangutan was named Suswoyo, an ex-captive adult female who I first met a decade earlier. At the time, she was 6.5 months pregnant when I encountered her while heading for breakfast. As I wrote in my diary for July 6, 1978, she took a liking to me and immediately climbed on my shoulders and back for a ride. Apparently, she did some damage the night before to the dining hall, though I was told she was a pretty good-natured gal. She was even-tempered, and I had developed a close relationship with her during the first 2 years at Camp Leakey. But during my visit in the late 1980s, I was giving an informal demonstration about orangutan intelligence to two of the Earthwatch volunteers. Both were nurses from the United States. Suswoyo happened to be behind the team house, digging in the soil for clay. She did that from time to time, perhaps addressing a mineral deficiency she might have had. I knew she was a good tool user, so I gave Suswoyo my pocket knife with one of the large blades out. She took the knife and started using it appropriately as a digging implement. I explained to the two nurses, yes, orangutans can make use of human tools or implements to solve problems on their own. Just watch Suswoyo. So Suswoyo kept digging and scraping the blade into the soil and then put it in her mouth to taste the dirt in the clay. I started to worry that she might cut her lips or mouth with the sharp blade, so I asked her to give it back to me in the Indonesian language. And of course, she ignored my request. So I proceeded to show the nurses just how smart I was. A big mistake. I said to Suswoyo in English, I said, Sis, look over there, pointing to a tree in the distance. Suswoyo turned and looked in that direction, and while she was distracted, I quickly pulled the knife from her hand. Real smart human, right? Well, I felt relieved that Suswoyo was safe again. She didn't appear upset and continued to sit next to me. And then I proceeded to explain to the two nurses that orangutans were capable of learning sign language. And then I could demonstrate the technique with Suswoyo. Now, I never did use Suswoyo during my first 2 years, except I tried it a little bit with her. So anyway, getting back to the reading, I grabbed her hands and said, the first thing you need to do is mold the hands. And as I continued to finish my sentence, Sassoyo grabbed my hands like a steel vise and slowly brought them towards her mouth. When I tried pulling them free, I couldn't. And like a slow moving wreck, I watched helplessly while Sassoyo put my hand into her mouth and punctured the back of my hand right below my ring finger with one of her large canine teeth. When she was done, she let my hand go and left the area. The two nurses asked me if I was okay. We looked at the clean hole that went into the tendons. I could watch my tendons move as I wiggled my finger, so no nerve damage. Then one of the nurses said, "You look white. I think you're going into shock." Fortunately, I was in good care as they washed the wound with antiseptic and covered it with gauze. And all I could think of was no diving in Bali this year. All
That's
right.
great. Yeah, and there are plenty of stories like that. The orangutans stealing canoes because they would watch the humans and they knew how to manipulate them in it's just really, really good stuff. So maybe we can get to some questions. We have about 8, 9 minutes left.
Okay.
Um, there are two in particular I'd like to get to. The first one is from Dr. Barbara King, who is with us. Hi, Barbara.
Hi,
Good
Barbara.
to good to see you, sort of. And Dr. King asks,
Oh, there she
"Oh,
is.
I if it's okay, I'll read the question. For those of us in the West who care about orangutans, we hear always about avoiding palm oil, and that's good guidance. But could you talk about the more comprehensive picture of how individuals can pitch in to help, especially given your point that you need to work within an Indonesian framework?"
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Thank you for that question, Barbara. Um, we in the West, we frequently will polarize issues and say all palm oil is bad. And we've got to realize that, for example, with palm oil, I would like to do that before moving on to the other part of the question. It employs millions of people at the smallholder level. We have to remember that not all palm oil is grown in large estate plantations, and that it is part of like 50% of the ingredients we would find in most supermarket products we would buy, and it's used in so many different ways. There's something called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. There's also the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil and Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil process, which are trying to make palm oil certified sustainable. That is the goal of the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which my organization is a voting member. So we don't want to just say boycott because, what are we going to do? Shift to another oil that could be actually more destructive by opening up, say, the Amazon for soy or some other product to replace it. So we just don't want to willy-nilly go in and just say, get rid of it. But we should look at the labeling to see if it in fact says sustainable on it or it says RSPO and actually purchase these items because that will improve the possibility of moving palm oil in the right direction towards sustainability. So that's the first thing I would say. The other one would be in the framework of the Indonesian environment. When we go to places like Indonesia and we decide to go off and say do an eco tour, we are actually taking our dollars and voting locally by showing the government officials those rainforests are more value kept standing to provide this sustainable industry called ecotourism, which employs not just the tour operators, but the boat folks, the hotel folks, the local people who supply the produce to the eco lodges and the boats. It provides an income that is quite significant. And so we can do that and do that in the right way. And so that's something I would just say within the Indonesian framework, and certainly encouraging the government to continue to do the right thing towards moving in a sustainable direction and valuing their wildlife and their natural resources for future generations, encouraging them in a positive way also goes, I think, makes a big difference. But the other thing I would say is we would like people to get involved by supporting organizations who have been out there and understand how to work within the system to move the process in the right direction. There's sometimes we move forward 3 or 4 steps, and then we have to move back 1 or 2 steps. And the idea is that over time, we're going to move in the right vector, in the right direction. And people have to realize that it is complex. It requires people who understand the culture, how to get things done in a country like Indonesia, and not just think that we as well-intended Westerners can throw our money around and make things happen. That is an arrogant way of operating. We have to get people to realize that when you go into countries like Indonesia or places in Africa, for example, that are dealing with the African apes and their environment, we have to realize that it's a different culture. We have to be familiar with that and work within those systems. I hope that answered your question, Barbara. Okay.
I have one more,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
a very straightforward question. This would probably take a couple of days to answer. By Ronnie's iPhone. How does one rehab an orangutan?
Rehab, yeah. Well, I think as I mentioned before, rehabbing is just a short form of rehabilitating an orangutan. And the idea is when you confiscate them, you want to return them to the wild. That was the idea of rehabilitating them to life in the wild. What we did in Camp Leakey was give those bicultural orangutans the choice of making the return to the forest their choice. And this is something that was unique to Camp Leakey. That doesn't happen today because today orangutans in the reintroduction programs are moved through the different bins of training and learning and assessment, and then they are relocated. And if they don't do well while they're being monitored, they're brought back and they may have to get some more training. But for the rehabilitation process that was first started at Camp Leakey, the orangutans would be part of the bicultural community of Camp Leakey, and you would be walking up and down the paths and you would encounter, Siswayo, just walking by, or maybe Kusasi. He came in, with big cheek pad. You got to watch out for him, and you walk on the boardwalk. You got to be careful of a hand coming out to grab you, maybe. It was a little bit more challenging, but these individuals had a chance to go into the forest to learn how to eat the forest food. Sometimes when the fruit was abundant, you wouldn't see them at Camp Leakey, But again, many of them would disappear. Some of them would disappear over time, especially the males, because one of the things you realize with orangutans, it's the male that leaves the natal area. So where it was born and where the mother has her home range, eventually those males leave as a way of emigrating out to prevent inbreeding. And so some of the males would leave. Others would stick around and become a nuisance, and they would have to be relocated to other parts of the national park. At that time, it wasn't a national park. And so today, no orangutans are being rehabilitated from Camp Leakey. There's a founder population. There are the descendants that are still there who go to the feeding station. And if you go out on an eco tour, you may run into, say, Princess's, one of her sons, or maybe one of her grandkids that's still out there. And so this provides an opportunity for people to see them. Many of them are still the wild orangutans out there that were studied by Dr. Galdikas. Many of them have already passed away, and their offspring are part of the wild population. And one of the things that the wildlife management did, a number of years ago, it said we don't want to reintroduce or rehabilitate orangutans into wild populations for a couple of good reasons. One, that these individuals may have cultural traits that they don't want to transfer to the wild population. If you're studying wild orangutans, you don't want them learning a new culture coming in from these human and influenced individuals. And the other, of course, is the health and safety. The diseases that they may be carrying, we don't want them to transfer them unknowingly into the wild population. So rehabilitation into like Tanjung Puting, that ended. It's now happening outside of the Tanjung Puting National Park in an area called the Lamandau, which is on the other side of the main city in the area, Pangkalan. And so, yeah, it's changed quite a bit. But I think I've answered your question, Ronnie, on what rehabbing is.
Yeah, okay, no, I think you have. Um, so why don't we end there? I just want to direct, thank you, Dr. Shapiro. I want to direct, thank you, the Brooklyn Book Festival for sponsoring this event. And I'd like to direct people to the chat. You can order the book. The author is Dr. Gary Shapiro. The book is called Out of the Cage. You won't be disappointed. So why don't
Thank
we
you.
leave it there?
All right.
Thank you,
If you've
everyone,
got any
for tuning
questions,
in.
visit my website, GaryLShapiro.com. I'm happy to answer more of your questions.
Also in the chat. So if you don't mind, folks, just cut and paste those links, and then you'll have everything you need. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.